a lieutenant general in the United States Army, a man who had dedicated his entire life to protecting his country, was racially profiled by the police and pulled over solely because of the color of his skin. This was not merely a personal injustice, but a symbol of a deeper systemic issue. Yet, instead of silently enduring the discrimination, he chose to stand up, igniting an unprecedented fight to reform the system from within. This is not just a story about injustice, but a powerful reminder that courage and faith in justice can bring about transformative change. Before diving into this compelling story, leave a comment sharing where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more inspirational content like this. The quiet atmosphere of a late afternoon lingered on a suburban road in Virginia. Army General John Carter had just finished a long day at the Pentagon and was heading home to enjoy a peaceful evening with his wife and children. His sleek black SUV rolled into a gas station, where the dim lighting reflected off his crisp military uniform. To Carter, the uniform was a symbol of decades of service to his country, and a profound source of pride for his duty and honor. A white patrol car parked nearby caught his eye as he stepped out to pump gas. The officer inside, Michael Barnes, stared at him through the windshield. Barnes's gaze betrayed suspicion, even though Carter had done nothing to warrant it. Carter frowned slightly, but reminded himself that this wasn't the first time he'd been judged solely based on his skin color. Ignoring the officer's stare, he walked into the convenience store to pay. When Carter returned to his vehicle, flashing lights from the patrol car appeared in his rearview mirror. A voice blared from the loudspeaker. "Vehicle in front. Pull over to the side." Carter frowned, checking his speedometer and the traffic signs. He had violated no laws. Nonetheless, he complied, pulling over and stopping his vehicle. The red and blue lights illuminated his rearview mirror as Barnes exited the patrol car, his right hand resting on the holstered gun at his side. Rolling down the window, Carter calmly asked, "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Barnes didn't answer the question. Instead, he curtly ordered, "License and registration." Carter silently handed over his documents, including his military ID prominently displaying his rank. Lieutenant General. Barnes glanced at it briefly, but his expression showed no recognition or respect. "Step out of the vehicle," Barnes barked. Maintaining his composure, Carter responded, "Officer, I am a military officer on duty, and I believe I have the right to know the reason for this request." Barnes smirked and raised his voice. "Step out of the vehicle now, or I will use force." Taking a deep breath, Carter unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out. He stood tall, imposing in his uniform, but Barnes showed no sign of backing down. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Barnes shouted. Carter slowly turned and met Barnes's gaze directly. His voice was steady, filled with authority. "Do you know who I am?" "I don't care who you are," Barnes replied with a sneer. "You're about to be arrested for resisting orders." Before Carter could respond, Barnes grabbed him, forcefully pushing him onto the hood of the car and snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. The cold clink of metal echoed sharply in the quiet evening, breaking the stillness around them. "You're making a big mistake," Carter said, his tone calm but firm. Barnes scoffed. "Oh? Let's see how big this mistake turns out to be." At that moment, a deep, commanding voice interrupted from behind. "Lieutenant General John Carter, United States Army." Barnes froze, his face draining of color as he turned around. Another black SUV had pulled up, and stepping out were Colonel Thomas Mills and two other military officers, their expressions grim. Their piercing gazes bore into Barnes like sharp blades, making the officer falter and visibly uneasy. In that instant, Barnes realized he had targeted the wrong person, and the cost of his mistake would be enormous. Barnes stood frozen, his body stiff like a statue, as Colonel Thomas Mills walked toward him, his cold, cutting gaze slicing through the tense atmosphere. Every step Mills took was deliberate, exuding an undeniable authority. The two military officers accompanying him maintained stern expressions, each keeping one hand near their holstered weapons, ready to act should the situation spiral out of control. "Release him immediately," Mills commanded, his voice deep and authoritative, leaving no room for argument. A small crowd began to gather nearby, drawn by the unusual scene. Barnes, the officer who had cuffed Lieutenant General John Carter, started trembling. His hand shook as he fumbled for the handcuff key, his eyes avoiding Mills's searing glare. I was just following the procedure," he stammered, his voice no longer carrying the toughness it had moments before. Mills stared at him, unflinching, his eyes filled with unmasked disdain. "Your procedure? What exactly is your procedure? Handcuffing a lieutenant general for no legitimate reason? Abusing your authority in public? Is that the procedure you're referring to?" Meanwhile, Carter stood silently, his hands now freed from the cold metal cuffs. He calmly adjusted his military uniform, his composure unshaken. However, his eyes lingered on Barnes, as if memorizing the officer's face. Mills stepped forward, his tall frame completely blocking Barnes from Carter. Lowering his voice, but with each word cutting through the air like a blade, Mills made sure the gathering crowd could hear. "Do you even know who this man is? This is Lieutenant General John Carter, a man who has spent over 30 years of his life serving and protecting this country. He has stood in the line of fire to defend the very freedom you enjoy. And this is how you treat him?" Barnes stammered, his face flushing red with shame and anger. "I didn't know who he was," he muttered, his voice growing quieter. I was just doing my job." Mills let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Doing your job? If this is how you do your job, then we have a serious problem." He pointed toward the crowd, where several people had started raising their phones to record the scene. "Everyone here has seen what you've done. You haven't just disrespected a distinguished man. You've disrespected the very values that your uniform is supposed to stand for." Barnes stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his gaze darting between Mills and Carter. The crowd had grown larger, and murmurs of disapproval began to ripple through it. A woman, standing near the front, spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "He's a hero. How could the police treat someone like this?" "Apologize," Mills ordered, his voice like a hammer striking against the silence. "You owe him an apology." Barnes bit his lip, clearly wrestling with himself. He glanced at Carter, then back at Mills, his eyes filled with stubborn defiance. "I don't think I need to apologize. I was just following protocol." The air seemed to freeze. Murmurs of anger rose from the crowd. An older man shook his head and said to the person beside him, "Unbelievable. We pay taxes for people like him to abuse their power?" Mills took another step forward, forcing Barnes to retreat half a step. Pointing directly at Barnes, Mills said, "Your protocol is wrong. That protocol represents bias and abuse of power. If you don't apologize right here and now, I guarantee you'll be answering to the entire nation for your actions." Carter, who had remained silent up to this point, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but each word carried a sharpness that cut through the tension. "Colonel Mills, that won't be necessary. His actions speak for themselves. Justice will handle the rest." Mills turned to Carter, his expression softening slightly, though his eyes still burned with determination. "Lieutenant General, I agree, but we won't let this go unchallenged. Barnes stood motionless, his face alternating between flushed red and ghostly pale. He avoided meeting anyone's gaze as the crowd grew louder. A few voices began shouting for his resignation. A young man yelled, "Get him out of the force!" Mills nodded to Carter, gesturing for him to return to his vehicle. As Carter walked away, he paused for a moment and turned to give Barnes one final look. His eyes were not filled with anger, but with profound disappointment. "I hope you reflect on your actions. But if you don't, rest assured the system will correct your mistakes." The crowd fell silent for a brief moment as Carter entered his vehicle, then erupted into chants of support. "Justice! Justice!" they shouted, their voices echoing across the parking lot. Barnes remained standing, seemingly frozen under the weight of the judgmental gazes surrounding him. Deep down, he knew he had made an irreparable mistake, and the cost of that mistake would be monumental. Just hours after the incident, a video capturing Lieutenant General John Carter being mistreated by Officer Michael Barnes surfaced on social media. A passerby had recorded the entire scene, including the moment Barnes handcuffed Carter and how Colonel Thomas Mills intervened. The video spread like wildfire, amassing millions of views and comments within hours. How can a man who has served and protected this country be treated like a criminal just because of the color of his skin? One Twitter comment read, hashtags such as Justice for General Carter, Stop Racial Bias, and End Police Abuse quickly trended across social media platforms. Short clips from the incident, particularly the image of Carter standing tall in his uniform and his authoritative words, became symbols of a growing movement against systemic injustice in policing. Veterans from various branches of the armed forces also expressed outrage. A group of veterans held a small press conference in Washington, holding signs that read, "We owe him respect, not humiliation. Justice for those who serve." Meanwhile, civil rights organizations such as the Racial Justice Association and the African American Legal Defense Fund quickly mobilized. They sent open letters to the police department demanding the suspension of Michael Barnes and an internal investigation into the incident. The local police department where Barnes worked found itself in the midst of a media crisis. Phones rang incessantly with public complaints, and protest emails poured in so rapidly that their system was temporarily overloaded. Some staff members at the department, though not directly involved, expressed shame at being associated with Barnes's actions. In response to the mounting pressure, Police Chief David Wilson held an emergency press conference. Standing before dozens of cameras, he struggled to maintain composure, his voice betraying his anxiety. "We have received significant feedback from the public. The incident involving Officer Barnes and Lieutenant General Carter is under investigation. We are committed to transparency in this process and will take appropriate actions if any violations are found." However, when asked whether Barnes would be immediately suspended, Wilson hesitated and avoided giving a direct answer, further fueling public outrage. Amid the growing furor, renowned journalist Rachel Monroe decided to step in. Known for her coverage of social and systemic injustices, Rachel recognized that this case went beyond one individual. It was a symptom of larger issues within the system. Rachel quickly reached out to Carter's team, proposing an exclusive interview. At first, Carter was hesitant. He did not want the incident to become overly sensationalized by the media. However, Angela, his wife, persuaded him, saying this was an opportunity to convey his message to the public. "John, this isn't just your story. It's the story of millions like us," Angela said, her eyes filled with determination. Ultimately, Carter agreed to meet Rachel at his home. The interview took place in the peaceful setting of Carter's living room. Angela sat beside her husband, holding his hand as a show of support. Rachel began with a personal question. "Lieutenant General Carter, when this happened, how did it make you feel? Not just as a soldier, but as a black man." Carter took a deep breath, his gaze distant. "I've faced countless challenges in my career, wars, loss, life and death decisions, but to be treated like a suspect because of my skin color, here in the country I've dedicated my life to protecting, that was more painful than anything else." Angela gently placed a hand on Carter's shoulder, as if lending him strength. Rachel continued, "Do you believe this incident is part of a larger issue?" Looking directly into the camera, Carter's voice carried weight. "This is not just a personal issue. It's a symptom of a flawed system where bias and prejudice are deeply ingrained. I'm not the only one who's experienced this, but if my story can help bring about change, I'm willing to stand up." The interview lasted nearly an hour and concluded with a final question from Rachel. "General, what do you hope will change because of this incident?" "I hope those in power will recognize the problem, but more importantly, I hope the younger generation will grow up in a society where they are treated fairly, judged not by their skin color, but by who they are." Rachel's interview aired on national television and quickly went viral on social media. The public was not only outraged, but also deeply moved by Carter's composure and courage. Numerous civil rights organizations began using Carter's words and images to launch campaigns demanding police reform. Peaceful protests sprung up across the country, with participants carrying banners reading, "Justice for Lieutenant General Carter," and "Don't judge us by our skin." Meanwhile, Police Chief Wilson was forced to suspend Michael Barnes pending investigation. Barnes was completely removed from public interaction, facing severe criticism not only from the public but also from his colleagues. The incident became more than just one man's story. It turned into a symbol of the larger fight for justice and equality. Carter received thousands of invitations to speak from major organizations, but he chose to work closely with civil rights groups to develop a long-term strategy to address systemic issues. Journalist Rachel Monroe later wrote another article declaring, "John Carter is not just a military general. He is a symbol of hope and change." After the video of the incident between Lieutenant General John Carter and Officer Michael Barnes went viral on social media, the consequences for Barnes became unavoidable. Although the officer was immediately suspended pending investigation, the negative fallout began to spread rapidly. Everything from his career and reputation to his relationships fell into jeopardy. As the incident exploded into public view, Barnes became the target of widespread criticism. Police Chief David Wilson and other department leaders faced intense public backlash, receiving a flood of demands to suspend and investigate Barnes's conduct. Meanwhile, Barnes found himself increasingly isolated from his colleagues. Some began to avoid him, refusing even to engage in routine work-related conversations. A few colleagues went so far as to publicly criticize his actions, calling him a disgrace to the badge and stating he no longer deserved to wear the uniform. Rumors about Barnes spread quickly within the law enforcement community. Several former associates openly declared they no longer wished to work with him. Once respected within the department, Barnes had now become a symbol of failure and embarrassment. Every time he stepped outside, he faced judgmental stares from people around him, even those he once considered friends. The psychological toll on Barnes deepened as he realized that not only his career, but also his personal life was unraveling. He could no longer leave his home without feeling scrutinized and judged. Unwanted phone calls from strangers began to flood in, filled with criticism and even threats. His phone buzzed incessantly with text messages mocking and condemning him for what he had done. Despite his attempts to maintain composure, Barnes couldn't stop replaying the events of that day in his mind. Night after night, he woke up in a state of anxiety, haunted by the question of whether he could ever atone for his actions. The guilt weighed heavier as he watched protests, civil rights organizations, and veterans collectively demanding justice for Lieutenant General Carter. The more he dwelled on it, the more he felt his life spiraling out of control. One night, in a half-dreamlike state, Barnes received a call from his brother, Robert. Robert, a retired firefighter, had always been someone Barnes trusted and leaned on in difficult times. He was the only person who hadn't distanced himself from Barnes during this ordeal. Yet, Robert's silence about the incident made Barnes realize that he needed help and that he had to change. But he had no idea where to start. With the wisdom gained from years of firefighting, Robert had faced countless harsh situations, from rescuing people in raging fires to navigating high-pressure scenarios. He understood that sometimes people needed to confront their mistakes to grow. "You can't just sit there wallowing in guilt, Michael," Robert said firmly. "You need to learn from this, to face reality and understand the harm you've caused. To do that, you need to attend a community workshop on racial bias and its impact. This is your chance to see where you went wrong and figure out how to make things right." Despite his brother's heartfelt advice, Barnes was still not ready to act. He held his phone in his hand, his thumb hovering over the screen, scrolling through the call log where Robert's name was displayed. His mind was a whirlwind of guilt and fear, torn between the weight of his past mistakes and the anxiety of confronting what had happened. Robert's words echoed in his mind. "You need to learn. You need to change." Yet every time Barnes thought about taking action, he felt as though his feet were chained to the ground. In the dim light of the room, he sat motionless on the chair, the faint glow of the street lights outside slipping through the partially drawn curtains. He wondered if he truly dared to face everything. His past mistakes loomed like an insurmountable wall, blocking the path to redemption. Each thoughtless word and careless action he had committed came rushing back, haunting him like restless ghosts refusing to let him go. Barnes recalled a story Robert had once told him, about a firefighter colleague who had confronted his own past mistakes. That man had overcome his fears and bravely stepped forward, using his failures to create positive change. Robert had shared the story with pride, as if to prove that anyone could change if they truly wanted to. But instead of inspiring Barnes, it only added to his sense of pressure. Was he really strong enough to step out from the shadow of his past? Or was he merely trying to avoid reality? The thought of standing in front of a group of strangers and attending a community workshop to admit his mistakes sent shivers down his spine. They might judge him and ask questions he couldn't answer. He would have to face the shame and open himself up to the people he had unintentionally hurt, and that was something he wasn't sure he could endure. Barnes sighed, his gaze fixed on the phone in his hand. "Can I change?" he wondered aloud, but no answer came. Robert's words brought a glimmer of hope, yet they also felt like a knife cutting into the hidden pain he carried. He didn't resent his brother. On the contrary, he knew Robert only wanted what was best for him. But how could he begin a journey when he didn't even know where it would lead? Barnes turned his eyes to the window. The streetlights shimmered in the night, as if inviting him to step outside. Yet, inside, he remained trapped by his fear. His shoulders sagged, weighed down not just by the burden of his past, but by the fear of confronting whatever lay ahead. He knew that silence and avoidance weren't the answers, but he wasn't ready to step out of his comfort zone just yet. Robert was right. To change, Barnes had to start somewhere. But not tonight. At this moment, all he could do was sit there, listen to the heavy thud of his heart, and hope that tomorrow he might find the strength to face the things he had been avoiding for far too long. But Barnes didn't know that while he was wrestling with his fears and doubts, another storm was silently brewing. Elsewhere, Lieutenant General John Carter, a man whose name Barnes had heard in connection with justice-driven battles, was facing a threat more severe than ever before. Despite enduring immense challenges and resistance from extremist groups, Lieutenant General John Carter remained steadfast in his fight for justice and equality. However, just as the movement he led became a national symbol, a new and profoundly dangerous threat emerged. The extremist group, Patriots of Purity, POP, infamous for its xenophobic views and opposition to societal progress, decided to target Carter and his family. As POP recognized Carter's growing influence within the community and among politicians, they launched a smear campaign to undermine his credibility. Anonymous accounts surfaced across social media platforms, spreading false information and twisting Carter's military service and statements from interviews. Members of POP sought to make Carter a lightning rod for criticism, attempting to erode public support for the movement he spearheaded. Carter is just a traitor using his skin color to trample on the truth, read one of the hate-filled messages circulated online. They branded him a usurper and a destroyer of the nation's traditional values. These attacks weren't just aimed at Carter himself. They sought to diminish the public's support for the cause he championed. The attacks didn't stop online. Poppy began issuing direct threats to Carter's family. Anonymous phone calls and emails containing explicit threats started to pour in. One message Carter received read, "If you continue this fight, your family will pay the price." One late evening, while the Carter family was enjoying a quiet dinner at home, an unexpected event unfolded. A black, unmarked truck pulled up directly in front of their house, and moments later, a group of masked individuals emerged carrying a gas canister. As the family sat in the living room, a strange noise outside caught their attention. The sound was faint at first, but grew louder, triggering an immediate sense of unease. Carter, always alert to potential threats, stood up and moved toward the window to investigate. What he saw froze him in his tracks. One of the masked individuals hurled the canister into the front yard. Within seconds, the air around the house began to fill with a dense, toxic fog. Carter's military instincts kicked in as he yelled to his family, urging them to move quickly to the safe room, a specially designed space equipped to handle emergencies. The family scrambled, fear gripping their every move as the acrid smell of the gas began to seep through the cracks of the house. Carter guided them with calm yet firm instructions, ensuring no one was left behind. Amidst the chaos, Angela grabbed the youngest child, clutching him tightly as they made their way to safety. Once inside the reinforced safe room, Carter secured the door and activated the emergency air filtration system. The family huddled together, shaken but safe for the moment. The system worked flawlessly, filtering the air and shielding them from the gas's harmful effects. Carter's foresight in installing the safe room had proven invaluable, but he knew this attack was no random act. It was a deliberate assault meant to instill fear and silence him. This incident not only heightened Carter's concerns about his family's safety, but also underscored the reality that POP was escalating from verbal threats to physical actions. Although the FBI and other law enforcement agencies quickly became involved, Carter realized that the danger had reached a critical level. Following the gas attack on Carter's home, the FBI, under the leadership of Special Agent Nathan Collins, launched an intensive investigation into Poppy. Collins, a seasoned agent with extensive experience in investigating extremist and terrorist groups, immediately convened emergency meetings to assess the situation and devise a response plan. Agent Collins ordered investigative teams to focus on gathering intelligence on Poppy from social media platforms, extremist organizations, and any leads that could help pinpoint the group's location. Online activity revealed that Poppy was planning a major attack on an upcoming public event Carter was set to attend. While the FBI investigated, an unexpected ally stepped forward. Robert Barnes, the brother of Officer Michael Barnes, who had previously helped Carter understand racial discrimination more deeply. Although Robert wasn't in law enforcement, his years as a firefighter had provided him with connections and access to valuable intelligence about Poppy. Robert discovered that Pop was planning a large-scale attack at an event Carter was scheduled to attend. The attack could result in catastrophic harm, not just to Carter, but also to his supporters. After contacting Agent Collins, Robert agreed to share critical information about key Pop members and suspected locations where the group might be hiding. Using Robert's intelligence, Agent Collins and his investigative team developed plans to raid Pop's hideouts. Further investigations identified several key figures within the group and uncovered details about their plans for the upcoming attack on Carter's event. After days of tension and exhaustion, when the FBI and security forces launched an operation to protect the Carter family, they decided to relocate Lieutenant General John Carter and his family to a safe location. A house far from major cities, fully equipped with protective measures, would serve as a temporary refuge from the threats they faced. However, the journey to safety proved far more perilous than they had anticipated. As Carter's convoy traveled through a desolate area far from the city center, the Patriots of Purity, Pop, launched a sudden ambush. Snipers from Pop, hidden in the surrounding woods, opened fire, while armed trucks blocked the main road. Carter and his family were immediately surrounded, and a fierce firefight erupted. The convoy consisted of 3 vehicles, including cars carrying FBI agents and security personnel. As gunfire rang out, the convoy halted, and everyone inside scrambled for cover. Carter, ever quick on his feet, immediately directed his family to move to the rear of the vehicle, taking refuge under the protection of the security team. The FBI agents, trained for high-stakes situations, swiftly deployed defensive tactics, returning fire against the PRP snipers. However, the attackers outnumbered them, and they were well trained. Bullets from PRP didn't just target the vehicles, but also the defensive positions of the FBI. Carter realized the escalating danger and knew that decisive action was necessary to save his family. As an experienced strategist, Carter quickly understood that relying solely on the FBI forces wouldn't be enough to hold their ground for long. Having commanded thousands of troops in grueling battles, he knew this was no time to wait for reinforcements. Carter ordered his family to stay in a safe position inside the vehicle while he stepped outside to assess the situation and assist the FBI agents. Using the combat skills honed over decades of service, Carter coordinated with the FBI to secure key defensive positions around the area, creating a solid line of defense to protect the convoy. Under Carter's leadership, the FBI agents regained their footing. They deployed effective countermeasures and began to push back the Poppy attackers. Carter's calm and decisive actions reorganized the security team, ensuring the safety of his family and supporting the FBI personnel engaged in the fight. As the firefight continued, Carter spotted a familiar figure among the attackers. The man standing at the front, signaling the Pop members to keep advancing, was none other than Ethan Holt, the leader of Pop. Amid the chaos, Carter saw an opportunity to confront Holt directly. Despite Holt's firepower and manpower advantage, Carter knew this encounter would be pivotal. His determination to protect his family wasn't just an act of survival. It was a message to Pop and anyone who sought to harm the innocent. "You can't run forever, Holt," Carter called out as he moved closer to the Poppy leader, his gaze resolute. Holt, recognizing Carter approaching, sneered. "You think you can change anything? This country's on the wrong path and you're leading the charge to its downfall, Carter." Carter remained undeterred, though Holt's words sparked reflection. "I can't change your past, Holt," Carter replied, "but I can do one thing, stop you from continuing down this path." The confrontation between Carter and Holt was not just a physical battle but also a clash of wills. Holt, driven by hatred and ostracism, had become Carter's enemy not only because of their differing beliefs, but also due to personal losses that fueled his animosity. Carter realized that Holt wasn't just an adversary, but also a victim of the very ideologies he fought to uphold. "What have you gained from all this, Holt?" Carter asked, his voice steady yet filled with understanding. "This hatred will get you nowhere." Holt hesitated for a moment, Carter's words piercing through his anger. He lowered his weapon slightly and faced Carter with a glare filled with bitterness. "You don't understand. I've lost my family and my friends because of people like you who want to change the world I once believed in. People like you don't know the cost." Holt went on to explain that his hatred toward Carter stemmed from his painful past, where he lost everything to the ideals Carter fought for. It was a pain he couldn't let go of, and to Holt, Carter symbolized all the forces that had led to his suffering. Carter listened, feeling the weight of Holt's anguish and anger, but he also knew that Holt's actions couldn't be justified by his pain. "You don't have to continue down this road. Stop and face the truth," Carter said, his voice calm yet firm. As Carter confronted Holt, the FBI gradually gained the upper hand. Their coordinated efforts pushed Pop out of key positions, and the attackers began to panic. Despite Holt's resolve, he recognized that the situation was slipping beyond his control. In the chaos, some of Holt's loyal followers managed to help him escape. However, the majority of Poppy members, including key operatives, were apprehended. Once the situation was under control, Carter returned to his family, ensuring they were safe. The FBI acted decisively, preventing Poppy from posing further immediate threats. After the ambush by the Patriots of Purity, Pop, and Lieutenant General John Carter's courageous efforts to protect his family, a surprising transformation began in a man few would have expected: Officer Michael Barnes. Previously, Barnes had treated Carter with unwarranted brutality, failing to realize that racial prejudice had driven his actions. Yet, the events he witnessed forced him to reflect on his decisions and, more importantly, ignited his determination to change. That day, when Pop attacked and a firefight broke out between the FBI and the assailants, Carter's resilience and leadership stood out. The image of Carter confronting Ethan Holt, fearless and steadfast, lingered in Barnes's mind, prompting him to reevaluate his own beliefs and actions. As a police officer, Barnes had always believed he was serving justice, but when faced with the truth about his past conduct, he began to see the flaws in his decisions, especially after witnessing Carter's battle for justice. Barnes realized that he had spent his life viewing the world through a narrow lens, never fully understanding the pain endured by people like Carter. A sense of remorse took hold of him, and he understood that instead of resisting those fighting for equality, he needed to work on transforming himself. Determined to change, Barnes decided to enroll in anti-bias and social justice training programs. He signed up for classes, workshops, and discussions led by experts in racial discrimination and justice. It was the first step on his journey toward self-improvement. In these programs, Barnes learned not only the theory behind systemic racism, but also listened to powerful personal stories from individuals who had faced discrimination. He was introduced to civil rights organizations whose tireless work for marginalized groups revealed the deep systemic inequities in society. Meeting these passionate and resilient advocates helped Barnes realize that every action he took could profoundly impact someone's life. Barnes didn't stop at attending workshops. He began applying what he learned to his daily life. He no longer judged people based on their race or socioeconomic background. Instead, he approached everyone with newfound respect and empathy. Though Barnes was committed to change, his journey was far from easy. After some time working with civil rights organizations, he decided to publicly apologize for his past mistakes. However, he was unprepared for the backlash his transformation provoked, especially from those who opposed police reform. At a public event, Barnes stood before a group of former officers and reform opponents who harshly criticized him. They denounced his change as a betrayal of his past values. Jeers and insults echoed in the room. But instead of walking away or remaining silent, Barnes chose to confront the criticism head-on and offered an open apology. "You may never forgive me, and I understand that," Barnes began, his voice steady despite the tense atmosphere. "I was wrong, and I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I am trying to be a better person, to make amends for my mistakes. I didn't fully understand what I was doing, and I hurt an innocent man, a man I deeply respect now." He paused, meeting the eyes of the crowd. "Carter is not my enemy. He is someone I need to learn from. I acted wrongly, and I won't just stand here and say I'm sorry. I will act to ensure I never repeat my mistakes." While some in the audience clapped, many others remained unconvinced, still viewing Barnes as a traitor unworthy of redemption. Yet, the negativity only strengthened Barnes's resolve to continue on his path. He knew he couldn't please everyone, but what mattered was that he had begun to change. He no longer allowed prejudice to dictate his actions. Barnes deepened his involvement in community activities, worked with civil rights organizations, and supported campaigns for police reform. Beyond his public efforts, Barnes also transformed his personal life. He rebuilt relationships with former colleagues who had witnessed his growth. His journey wasn't limited to changing his views on race. He also focused on listening to and supporting others who were fighting for their rights. Gone was the arrogance and narrow-mindedness that had defined him. He now approached the world with openness and a willingness to learn from those around him. Barnes understood that change was not an easy journey, but what mattered most was that he had chosen the right path. He wasn't just changing for himself, but for those he had wronged in the past. Above all, he was determined never to return to the mistakes of his former self. Through Lieutenant General John Carter's relentless efforts, the movement to reform the police system went beyond protests and congressional meetings, spreading across the nation. Carter, as a prominent and influential figure, became a symbol in the fight for justice, not just for himself, but for all those who had been racially discriminated against and oppressed in society. Lawmakers, civil rights organizations, and community groups began to rally around the movement, transforming it into an unstoppable force. A key part of Carter's strategy was collaborating with civil rights organizations and justice advocacy groups to apply pressure on lawmakers. He not only focused on building relationships with politicians, but also directly engaged with community groups, discussing practical solutions to reduce bias in policing. Leveraging his reputation in the military and community, Carter organized meetings with legislators to advocate for reform bills. These bills demanded a more transparent police system and greater accountability for law enforcement. The reforms were built around three fundamental principles: transparency, accountability, and justice. Carter emphasized that only through independent oversight and accountability could the trust between communities and law enforcement be rebuilt. Civil rights organizations played a crucial role in spreading awareness and rallying support for the legislation. Groups like the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and other civil society organizations organized campaigns to demand changes in police practices and to confront systemic racism within law enforcement. To draw further public attention and push the reform agenda, Carter participated in a large rally held in Washington, D.C. Thousands of people from across the country attended, united by the common goal of demanding police reform and fighting racial discrimination. On that day, under the blazing sun, the crowd packed the area surrounding the Capitol. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation as everyone waited for the movement's leaders to deliver powerful speeches. When Carter stepped onto the podium, all eyes turned to him. A gentle breeze swept through, creating a moment of stillness before he began to speak. "This is not just my story. It's all of ours," Carter began, his voice strong and resolute. "I stand here today not just as a victim, but as part of a system that we must change. A system where so many of us have endured discrimination, injustice, and oppression. I cannot stand by and watch our nation continue down this path." He paused, letting his words sink in. Police officers are not just protectors. They are servants of the community. And when they serve, they must do so with transparency and fairness. They must be held accountable for their actions because that is the only way to rebuild the public's trust in law enforcement. Carter took a deep breath before continuing. "I stand here today to say that we cannot remain silent. Change must come now, and we must be the ones to make it happen. We must create a society where everyone can live with dignity, respect, and protection." Carter's speech ignited a wave of support, not only from those at the rally but from the wider public. The participation of thousands at the rally demonstrated that the movement had grown beyond those directly affected by racial discrimination or policing issues. It had evolved into a call for fairness for all, regardless of race, religion, or ethnicity. Civil rights groups, activists, and even veterans began speaking out in support of the reform legislation. They recognized that this wasn't just a fight for individual rights, but a battle to uphold the nation's core values, to build a society free from discrimination, where everyone could coexist in peace. With strong backing from the public and civil rights organizations, lawmakers found themselves under immense pressure. The reform bill became one of the most pressing issues in the political landscape of the year. Congressional debates grew, increasingly heated, and discussions around the bill became more urgent than ever. Carter and his allies continued to push the legislation forward, steadfast in their resolve to see it enacted. Despite the movement's significant successes, Carter knew that the struggle would not be easy. Opponents of reform, particularly those who defended the status quo in policing, began to push back forcefully. Certain political groups, especially conservative factions, publicly opposed the reform bill, arguing that it would weaken law enforcement and destabilize society. Carter and his allies faced not only the challenge of maintaining public support, but also navigating resistance within Congress and government agencies. Nevertheless, Carter remained steadfast in his belief that the fight was not just for himself, but for the millions of Americans who yearned for a more equitable future. With the police reform movement, led by Lieutenant General John Carter, gaining significant attention from both the government and the public, the extremist group Patriots of Purity, POP, could not remain idle. Viewing this change as a threat to their ideals, they decided to stage one final attack on a pivotal event. Their target was a community meeting chaired by Carter, where he was set to announce new advancements in police reform. The PIP meticulously planned their assault. They knew Carter's meeting would attract thousands of attendees, presenting what they believed to be their last chance to undermine the reform movement. The group's leader, Ethan Holt, spearheaded the operation. Supported by a core of devoted extremists, the plan involved inciting chaos, provoking violence, and employing forceful attacks. Armed with weapons and small explosives intended to create panic, their strategy aimed not only to cause disruption, but also to discredit Carter. However, amidst their preparations, one of their own, Lisa Turner, began questioning the group's motives and objectives. Lisa Turner had joined POP under pretenses, initially believing in the group's rhetoric. Over time, she realized that their actions were not contributing to a better society, but instead perpetuating hatred and violence. A person with genuine ideals for justice, Turner grew increasingly uneasy as she witnessed the group's destructive methods and toxic ideology. As she observed the growing disparity between POP's propaganda and their actions, Turner found herself unable to tolerate their violence and hatred. One day, she made the courageous decision to defect and provide critical information to the FBI, exposing POP's plan to attack Carter's meeting. Aware that this decision might endanger her life, Turner resolved that she could no longer stand by as the group sowed further division and harm. With Turner's intel, the FBI immediately launched an investigation and devised strategies to thwart the attack. Recognizing the severity of the threat, the FBI mobilized significant resources to ensure the safety of Carter and the community. Thanks to Turner's information, the FBI deployed extensive security measures around the meeting. The venue and its surroundings were thoroughly inspected, and security teams, including FBI personnel, were stationed to handle any emergency. On the day of the meeting, the atmosphere was tense yet filled with hope. As the Patriots of Purity, POP group approached the area, they were unaware that the FBI had already surrounded them. By this point, the FBI had identified the positions and movements of the POP members, fully prepared for a confrontation. When POP initiated its actions, the tension at the community meeting led by Lieutenant General John Carter heightened significantly. However, the FBI, having been prepared thanks to the intelligence provided by Lisa Turner, swiftly reacted, implementing intervention measures before POP could execute its attack. The sound of alarms blared as FBI agents, clad in bulletproof gear, emerged from multiple directions, effectively intercepting POP. Some POP members immediately drew their weapons and retaliated, leading to a brief but intense gunfight. However, the FBI's professional training and coordinated tactics quickly brought the situation under control. Despite their numerical advantage, the POP attackers were no match for the FBI's organization and advanced equipment. In less than 10 minutes, the confrontation ended. The gunfire ceased as agents secured the entire area. Many POP members were arrested, including key leaders like Ethan Holt. Holt, a notorious figure in extremist circles, resisted fiercely but was ultimately subdued. As he was handcuffed and led away, his gaze betrayed no remorse, only defiance, as if to send the message that his fight was far from over. The arrests at the scene not only prevented a dangerous attack, but also led to significant progress in dismantling the POP network. During a thorough search, FBI agents uncovered a trove of critical documents hidden in the group's vehicles. These documents included a list of POP's key members and their contact information, detailed plans for other attacks targeting public events and prominent individuals in the reform movement, financial records exposing the group's secret funding sources and sponsors, and a map marking POP's hideouts across the country. In addition, the technology seized from POP provided valuable intelligence. The FBI recovered hard drives containing internal communications, email exchanges. Between members and propaganda videos, the group intended to distribute on social media to rally support. This information was promptly sent to the FBI's labs for analysis, enabling investigators to identify previously unknown members of the network. Based on the evidence collected, the FBI immediately launched a series of coordinated raids at multiple locations nationwide. Within 48 hours of the arrests at the community meeting, dozens of POP safe houses were raided and dismantled. Several senior POP members who had not been present at the meeting were apprehended during these operations. Among them was the group's financial manager, responsible for maintaining POP's secret funds and distributing money for illegal activities. His arrest significantly weakened the group's operational capabilities. Furthermore, the FBI uncovered evidence linking POP to several secret sponsors, including wealthy business people and underground organizations. Once exposed, these sponsors faced legal investigations, rendering them unable to continue funding POP's extremist activities. The FBI's successful operation not only prevented a potentially catastrophic attack, but also marked a turning point in dismantling POP entirely. With the group's key members and financial resources under control, POP could no longer orchestrate large-scale operations. This was a critical blow to the organization, drastically reducing the threat it posed to society. The courageous actions of Lisa Turner, who provided pivotal intelligence, were also widely acknowledged by the public. Her story became a reminder of the power of personal transformation and a testament that even individuals within extremist groups could find the courage to do what was right. While the attack was prevented, Lisa Turner's decision to come forward made a profound impression on both the FBI and the public. She became a symbol of awakening and bravery, standing against extremist ideologies. After POP's network was dismantled, Turner publicly shared her story with the media, explaining that she could no longer be part of a group that perpetuated hatred and violence. In a televised interview, Turner confessed, "I was wrong to believe what they told me. Violence and hatred cannot solve our problems. That's not the life I want to lead, and I couldn't continue being part of this group. I made a mistake, and I hope others can learn from it." Turner's words deeply moved the community, and she became an advocate against extremism. The public began to see that not everyone in extremist groups fully aligned with their ideologies, and Turner's story demonstrated that change was possible for those willing to confront their mistakes. This event marked a significant turning point in Carter's struggle and the reform movement. The meeting proceeded successfully, with overwhelming community participation and Carter delivering a powerful address. He reiterated that police reform was not just a personal demand, but a societal necessity. We cannot allow groups like POP to continue tearing apart our society. We must stand united. We must defend justice and equality. Change is coming, and we will not let anyone stop us, Carter declared. The police reform bill, though still facing opposition, gained momentum thanks to recent successes and strong public support. It moved closer to passing in Congress. Carter and his allies continued their work undeterred, determined to push forward despite resistance from extremist forces. The long and arduous fight for justice and equality had finally culminated in a historic victory. The Police Reform Bill, a decisive piece of legislation shaping the future of law enforcement and justice, was officially passed by Congress. This victory was not just for Lieutenant General John Carter, but for everyone who had stood beside him, for those who had sacrificed to bring about this change. It was a triumph of perseverance, of relentless efforts to restore justice and build a fairer society. The bill, with key provisions on transparency, accountability, and independent oversight of law enforcement, was not just a reform for the police system, but also a step toward reducing discrimination and abuse of power. This was the result of arduous struggles, not just against conservative forces within the government, but also against extremists in society. Every step in this journey had come at a cost, but now all the efforts had finally paid off. When news of the bill's passage was announced, the Carter household was filled with joy and pride. But for Carter, this victory was not merely a milestone in his career. It was recognition of the long journey he had undertaken, and most importantly, it was a victory for his family, those who had stood by him and supported him through this difficult path. Shortly after hearing the news, Carter returned home, where Angela and their children awaited him. A sense of relief enveloped him as he stepped through the door, greeted by the warmth of his family's embrace. At that moment, he realized that every sacrifice, every moment of hardship had been worth it. He hugged his wife, their eyes meeting as he whispered, "This is our victory, not just for today, but for the generations to come." Angela smiled, but there was a trace of worry in her eyes. "John, you've won, but that doesn't mean everything will change overnight," she said, her voice gentle but realistic. Carter nodded, fully aware that this was just the beginning. Carter was no longer just a soldier or a general. He had become a symbol of the modern civil rights movement. He wasn't only fighting to defend the values of the nation, but was also leading the charge against racial discrimination, abuse of power, and injustice. His speeches and actions inspired millions, from civil rights activists to everyday citizens. The movement Carter led was not simply a fight for justice for one person, but a battle for an entire community, an entire nation. Civil rights organizations, lawmakers, and reform advocates saw in Carter a leader with vision and unwavering commitment to the principles they all shared. This journey was never easy. Extremist groups like the Patriots of Purity, PAPI, repeatedly threatened Carter and his family. They even targeted his supporters, attempting to sow fear and doubt. But these actions only strengthened Carter's resolve. On the night before the reform bill was passed, Carter sat alone, looking out the window as the city lights reflected in his eyes. He thought about all those who had sacrificed for this fight, the children, the future generations he was striving to create a better world for. The streetlights outside reminded him of countless sleepless nights, hours-long meetings with lawmakers, and tense moments when everything seemed on the brink of collapse. Carter silently thanked those who had stood by him, his comrades in the military, his friends in the movement, and, most importantly, his family. "This victory isn't mine alone," he reflected. "It belongs to everyone who believed and sacrificed for our shared ideals." Carter knew his work was far from over. The police reform bill was a significant step forward, but he understood that real change required the participation of the entire society. Police needed retraining. Oversight systems had to be reinforced, and, most importantly, societal prejudice had to be eradicated. Turning to look at his wife and children, Carter took a deep breath. "We've done it. But the work isn't finished," he said. "We will keep fighting for a better society." His words weren't just for his family. They resonated in the hearts of everyone who had followed his journey. Carter believed that the future could and would be better if people held on to their faith in change. As the day ended, Carter stood under the glow of the setting sun, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew that future generations would remember this fight as a turning point in history. But he also understood that justice was never a final destination. It was a long journey requiring patience and unwavering determination. Angela approached him, placing her hand on his shoulder with a look of understanding. "John, we've started something great. You don't have to do it all on your own. Let others continue this journey, too." Carter smiled, feeling the warmth and strength of his family. He knew that he wasn't just fighting for society, but also for his children and a future they could be proud of. With that conviction, Carter was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The fight for justice had achieved a significant victory, but the journey toward equality continued, a flame that would burn endlessly in the hearts of those who longed for change. Lieutenant General John Carter's story is not just one of personal challenges, but a symbol of the fight for justice and systemic change. His confrontation with injustice and extremists proved that courage, unity, and faith in what is right can bring about true transformation. What do you think about Carter's journey and the lessons it offers? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share the story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more inspirational tales. Thank you for watching.
The sun dipped low over the quiet suburban street, casting a golden glow on the neatly trimmed lawns and picket fences. Old Mr. Jefferson, a retired history teacher and beloved grandpa, strolled along the sidewalk, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. Dressed in his usual attire, pressed slacks, a button, up shirt, and a tweed cap, he hummed to himself, savoring the crisp evening air. But tranquility shattered when a police cruiser screeched to a halt beside him. Out stepped Officer Brandon, a man whose uniform seemed strained under his own self-importance. His piercing blue eyes narrowed as they fixed on Mr. Jefferson, an unsettling smirk playing on his lips. "Hey, you. What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The officer barked, his hand already hovering over his holstered weapon. Mr. Jefferson paused, confused but calm. "Just taking a walk, officer. Is there a problem?" Brandon's smirk vanished, replaced by a sneer. "Yeah, there is. A problem with trespassers like you loitering where you don't belong." Mr. Jefferson's heart sank, but he kept his voice steady. "Officer, I live just 3 houses down. I've been in this neighborhood for 30 years. But Brandon didn't seem interested in explanations. His hand moved to his gun, and his voice turned cold. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back, now." Mr. Jefferson complied slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. His cane clattered to the ground as he raised his hands, his joints aching with the effort. "Easy there, officer," he said, his voice steady despite the indignity of the moment. "There's no need for the gun. I'm just a man out for his evening walk." But Brandon's posture remained rigid, his hand resting firmly on the weapon at his hip. His tone was sharp and dripping with disdain. "Don't give me that. I've seen your type before, always trying to look like you belong. Trespassing, casing houses, probably up to something shady. You don't fool me." The accusation stung, but Mr. Jefferson didn't flinch. He looked up at the younger man, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You think you know me, but you don't. All you see is the color of my skin." Brandon snorted, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Don't pull the race card on me, old man. I call it like I see it, and right now, I see a perp who needs to be taught a lesson." The officer grabbed his radio and muttered into it, calling for backup. Passers-by had begun to gather at a safe distance, their whispers and murmurs creating a hum of tension in the air. Some recorded on their phones, while others looked on in stunned silence. Mr. Jefferson sighed, a deep, weary sound. He'd faced moments like this before, though not in years. He had hoped, such blatant discrimination was a thing of the past. Yet here he was, a black grandfather being treated as a criminal on the street he'd lived on for decades. "Officer," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you're making a mistake." Brandon smirked again, clearly enjoying the power he held. "We'll see about that. Hands behind your back, now." As the officer reached for his cuffs, Mr. Jefferson shook his head slightly. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" Brandon scoffed. "Yeah, you're a guy about to spend the night in a cell. That's who you are." But Mr. Jefferson's expression didn't change. If anything, a small, knowing smile began to form at the corners of his lips, the kind of smile that suggested he had an ace up his sleeve. The crowd leaned in, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Something was about to happen, and no one could predict what it would be. Brandon yanked out his cuffs, the metallic clink of the chain echoing ominously. Mr. Jefferson remained calm, his weathered hands now resting behind his back. His composure only seemed to irritate the officer further. As Brandon reached for his wrist, Mr. Jefferson spoke again, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "Before you put those cuffs on me, you should probably call your superior." Brandon chuckled darkly. "Oh, I don't think so. I'm the law here, old man. You don't get to make demands." Mr. Jefferson turned his head slightly, meeting Brandon's eyes. There was no fear there, only quiet authority. "Call your superior. Trust me on this." The words were simple, but the tone carried weight. Something in the way Mr. Jefferson spoke gave Brandon pause, though his ego wouldn't let him show it. With a derisive laugh, he clicked one cuff around Mr. Jefferson's wrist. "You think you're special? Let me guess, you're going to call some lawyer buddy, maybe cry about this being unlawful detention." Brandon taunted as he secured the second cuff. Mr. Jefferson didn't respond. He simply stood there, dignified despite the cuffs, as the crowd murmured louder. The phones capturing the moment were no longer just discreetly filming. People were outright calling out now. "Hey, you can't treat him like that," shouted a young woman from the sidewalk. "He's just walking. What's wrong with you?" another voice added. Brandon ignored them all, his focus on maintaining his image of control. But his confidence was about to face a test he couldn't anticipate. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the scene, gliding to a stop with a quiet authority of its own. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped a tall man in a crisp navy suit. His badge, prominently displayed on his belt, gleamed in the fading sunlight. It was Chief Alexander Jefferson, the police chief of the entire city. The crowd gasped, recognizing the man instantly. Brandon's smug demeanor faltered for the first time. He straightened up, visibly nervous, though he tried to mask it with a stiff salute. "Chief Jefferson, sir." "I wasn't expecting." The chief cut him off with a single, icy glare that could have frozen fire. His voice, calm but carrying an undeniable edge, sliced through the tense atmosphere. "Officer Brandon, I believe you have something of mine." Brandon blinked, confused. "Sir." Chief Jefferson stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. He pointed toward Mr. Jefferson. "That man you just cuffed." "That's my father." The crowd erupted into murmurs and gasps as Brandon's face drained of color. His eyes darted between the chief and Mr. Jefferson, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But Chief Jefferson wasn't done, not by a long shot. Chief Jefferson's voice dropped to an ominous calm, the kind that demanded absolute attention. "Officer Brandon, uncuff him, now." Brandon fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he hurried to obey. The cuffs clattered to the ground as Mr. Jefferson rubbed his wrists, his expression unreadable but composed. "Sir, I didn't know," Brandon stammered, his face pale and sweat beading on his forehead. "I thought he was—" "You thought he was what?" Chief Jefferson interrupted, his tone sharper now. "A threat, a criminal. Or is it just that you thought a black man walking down the street couldn't possibly belong in this neighborhood?" The crowd had gone silent, their attention fixed entirely on the unfolding drama. Some had stopped recording, sensing the gravity of the moment. Others, however, held their phones up, intent on capturing every second. Brandon shifted uncomfortably, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of the chief's scrutiny. "Sir, I was just following protocol." He was acting. Suspicious. "Suspicious?" Chief Jefferson echoed, his eyebrows rising. He turned to his father, gesturing toward the fallen cane. "Dad, were you being suspicious?" Mr. Jefferson bent slowly to retrieve his cane, straightened up, and gave a slight shrug. "Unless humming old jazz tunes is a crime these days, I'd say no." The crowd chuckled nervously, but the chief wasn't amused. He turned back to Brandon, his voice like steel. "Let me make this clear. My father has lived in this neighborhood for longer than you've been alive. He's a retired teacher, a respected member of this community, and, most importantly, a human being who deserves respect. You, on the other hand, just put an innocent man in cuffs because you couldn't see past your own bias." "Sir, I didn't mean—" Brandon started, but the chief cut him off again, stepping closer. "You didn't mean that's your excuse. You pulled a gun on an unarmed senior citizen who was walking with a cane. You called backup for a man taking an evening stroll, and you humiliated him in front of his neighbors, all because you assumed he didn't belong here." Brandon's mouth worked soundlessly. The authority he'd wielded so recklessly just minutes ago was nowhere to be found. The chief's gaze hardened. "Do you know what's worse than your actions, Officer Brandon? The fact that you don't even realize how wrong they are. But you will." The weight of the statement hung heavy in the air, and Brandon's face twisted with uncertainty and dread. Chief Jefferson turned to the crowd, addressing them directly. "Thank you all for bearing witness to this. I assure you this matter will not go unaddressed." He gestured toward his father, who stood tall despite the ordeal. "And to everyone here, remember that no one, no matter their age, color, or walk of life, should be treated as less than human." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding, others clapping softly. The chief then turned back to Brandon, who now looked like a man waiting for his sentence to be pronounced. "Get back in your cruiser," Chief Jefferson said firmly. "We'll have a long conversation back at the station, and I mean long." Brandon nodded weakly, scurrying back to his car without another word. The crowd parted as he drove away, his tail between his legs. As the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of support and indignation rippling through them, Mr. Jefferson turned to his son, his expression calm but edged with concern. "Alex," he said quietly, his voice steady as ever, "you didn't have to come out here for this. I could have handled it." Chief Jefferson sighed, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, I know you could have. You've handled men like him your whole life, but you shouldn't have to, not anymore." For a moment the two men stood in silence, the weight of unspoken history between them. Mr. Jefferson nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "I appreciate it, son, but this isn't just about me. You know that, don't you?" The chief nodded. "I do, and I won't let it slide. Brandon's actions aren't just a mistake. They're a symptom of something bigger, something I'm responsible for addressing in my department." Mr. Jefferson studied his son, the pride in his eyes evident. "You've always been one to tackle things head on. Just make sure you're careful. There are plenty of people who won't take kindly to you shaking up the status quo." Chief Jefferson gave a wry smile. "Since when has that ever stopped me?" The old man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It hasn't, but don't let it burn you out." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a young woman from the crowd, her phone still clutched in her hand. She looked nervous but determined. "Excuse me, Chief Jefferson," she said hesitantly. The chief turned to her, his professional demeanor softening. "Yes, ma'am. I just wanted to say thank you," she began, her voice gaining strength, "for standing up for your dad, for saying what you did. A lot of us, we see things like this happen, but we don't know what to do. I've got this on video, and if you need it for anything," the chief held up a hand, a small smile on his lips. "I appreciate that, truly, hold on to it for now, but I hope it won't come to that. My department needs to address this internally first, but knowing the community is watching, holding us accountable, that's a powerful thing." The young woman nodded, looking relieved. "Well, just know that we've got your back, both of you." She glanced at Mr. Jefferson, who tipped his cap to her with a warm smile. "Much obliged, young lady." As she walked away, Chief Jefferson turned back to his father. "You ready to head home?" Mr. Jefferson shook his head. "Not yet. I think I'll finish my walk. Need to clear my head. Want me to walk with you?" "Nah," the old man said, tapping his cane on the pavement. "I've been walking these streets long before today. I won't let one bad encounter make me afraid of my own neighborhood." The chief watched as his father started down the sidewalk, his steps deliberate but unbowed. For a moment he hesitated, but then he smiled, a rare, genuine smile. Mr. Jefferson may have been put through the ringer, but his dignity and strength remained untouched, and in that moment the chief knew that the fight for justice, though hard and often thankless, was always worth it. As he turned back to his SUV, his mind was already working, plotting out the changes he would make to ensure no one else would face what his father had. This wasn't just about fixing one officer's behavior. It was about creating a culture where bias and abuse of power had no place to thrive. The road ahead would be long, but he was ready to walk it, just like his father. The evening air grew cooler as Mr. Jefferson continued his walk, his steps deliberate but calm, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. Neighbors who had witnessed the scene earlier now greeted him warmly as he passed. A young boy on a bicycle stopped and waved. "Hi, Mr. Jefferson. You okay?" the boy asked, concern evident in his small voice. Mr. Jefferson smiled kindly. "I'm fine, young man. Just out enjoying the evening." The boy nodded, seemingly reassured, and pedaled off. It was a small exchange, but it reminded Mr. Jefferson of the goodness still present in his community, a stark contrast to the ugliness he had just experienced. Meanwhile, back at the station, Chief Jefferson was preparing to make good on his promise. Officer Brandon sat in a small conference room, his smug confidence long gone, replaced with visible discomfort. Across the table sat Chief Jefferson, his presence commanding even in silence. "You know why you're here, Officer Brandon." The chief began, his voice cold and precise. Brandon nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." "No, I don't think you do." The chief continued, leaning forward slightly. "You're here because your actions today reflect not just poorly on you, but on this entire department, and I can't tolerate that." Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, I made a mistake. I thought—" "You thought," the chief interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "You thought it was acceptable to pull a gun on an unarmed, elderly man walking in his own neighborhood. You thought cuffing him without any evidence of wrongdoing was following protocol. Tell me, Officer Brandon, what exactly were you thinking?" Brandon had no response, his face reddening with shame. The chief's tone softened, but his words carried even more weight. "Do you know what's worse than your actions today, officer? It's the fact that this isn't just about you. This is about a system that allows people like you to wear this badge without understanding the responsibility it carries. A system that I'm responsible for fixing." Brandon swallowed hard. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "But it did," the chief said sharply, "and because of that, there will be consequences. Effective immediately, you're suspended without pay pending a full investigation. And you'll be required to attend mandatory bias training if you expect to have any chance of wearing this badge again." Brandon's eyes widened. "Sir, please, no," the chief said firmly, cutting him off. "This isn't negotiable. Your behavior today is exactly what erodes public trust in law enforcement. If you can't understand the gravity of that, you have no place in this department or any other." The room fell silent, the weight of the chief's words settling heavily in the air. Brandon slumped slightly, his bravado completely gone. Chief Jefferson stood, his towering presence leaving no room for argument. "You can leave now. And I suggest you spend some time reflecting on what it means to serve and protect all members of this community." Brandon rose slowly, muttering a quiet, "Yes, sir," before leaving the room. Alone in the conference room, Chief Jefferson let out a long breath. The anger and frustration simmered beneath the surface, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't about him. It was about ensuring no one else, no matter their age, race, or background, would experience what his father had endured today. He returned to his office and began drafting a memo to the entire department, mandatory training, a review of protocols, a public statement acknowledging the incident. He would address this head on, just as he had promised his father. Out on the street, Mr. Jefferson finished his walk, his pace steady and determined. He passed by his neighbors' smiling faces, their nods of respect and solidarity giving him strength. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had weathered countless storms, and would continue to do so, no matter what. It wasn't just about him, it was about paving the way for others, so that someday they wouldn't have to endure the same. As Mr. Jefferson approached his house, the familiar porch light glowing softly in the twilight, he paused. His mind replayed the events of the evening, not with anger or bitterness, but with determination. His years as a teacher had taught him that ignorance wasn't always deliberate, it could be confronted and corrected. Change, though slow and arduous, was possible. The door opened before he could reach for the knob. His granddaughter Maya stood there, her face a mixture of relief and worry. "Grandpa, are you okay?" she asked, rushing to hug him. He patted her back gently, smiling. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just a little excitement during my walk." She pulled back, her eyes wide. "Excitement? I saw the video online. It's already going viral. People are furious at that cop." Mr. Jefferson chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Let them be. Sometimes people need to see things for themselves to understand what others go through. But anger alone won't fix anything, Maya. Change comes from action." She nodded thoughtfully, her admiration for her grandfather evident. "What kind of action?" "Education, for one," he said, leaning on his cane. "Accountability, for another, and compassion, always compassion. We have to lead by example, even when it's hard." Maya nodded, her young mind already racing with ideas. "Maybe we can organize something, like a community meeting. Talk about what happened and what we can do to make things better." Mr. Jefferson smiled warmly. "Now you're thinking like a leader." Inside, as the family gathered around the dinner table, the conversation continued. They spoke about the challenges they faced as a black family in a society still grappling with its prejudices, but also about the opportunities to educate, advocate, and push for systemic change. Meanwhile, at the police station, Chief Jefferson was putting the finishing touches on his department-wide memo. The words were direct and unflinching, addressing not just the incident but the broader need for accountability and reform. It wasn't enough to reprimand one officer. The entire department needed to be part of the solution. When he finally returned home, exhausted but resolute, he found his father still awake, sitting in his favorite armchair with a cup of tea. "Long day, huh?" Mr. Jefferson said with a knowing smile. The chief sighed, sitting across from him. "You could say that, but it's not over. This is just the beginning." "That's the spirit," his father replied, lifting his cup in a mock toast. "Remember, the path to justice is rarely easy, but it's always worth walking." The chief nodded, his respect for his father growing even more profound. "You're right, as usual." Mr. Jefferson leaned back in his chair, his smile warm but tinged with the wisdom of experience. "I've been through a lot in my years, Alex, seen a lot of ugliness, but I've also seen people rise above it. You've got a chance to do that now for yourself, for your department, and for this city. Don't waste it." "I won't," the chief promised, and he meant it. The next morning, as the sun rose over the neighborhood, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such a pivotal moment. Neighbors waved to one another with a renewed sense of connection. The Jeffersons' porch became a hub of conversation, a place where people stopped to share their thoughts and feelings. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had started, and it started not with anger or violence, but with strength, resilience, and the quiet determination of a grandfather who refused to be diminished. Mr. Jefferson, cane in hand, stepped out onto the sidewalk once more. This time, he didn't just walk, he led.
It was a brisk Monday morning in downtown Atlanta. The streets hummed with the rhythm of the city's heartbeat, cars weaving in and out of traffic, pedestrians clutching coffee cups as they hurried to work. Among them was Malcolm Green, a polished, 38-year-old executive at a leading tech firm. Dressed in a navy blue tailored suit, Malcolm exuded confidence as he walked into the parking garage to retrieve his sleek black Tesla. As he slid into the driver's seat and pressed the start button, the car hummed to life. He adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror and double-checked his phone. A big meeting awaited him, and his team was counting on him to present their latest project, a groundbreaking app designed to promote diversity and inclusion in workplaces. The drive was smooth, the autopilot handling the morning gridlock with ease. But just as Malcolm was nearing the expressway, flashing blue and red lights lit up his rearview mirror. The sharp wail of a police siren pierced the air. Malcolm sighed. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath. He pulled over to the shoulder, careful to position his car away from traffic. A police officer, tall and broad-shouldered with a mirrored pair of aviators, stepped out of the patrol car. The officer's gait was slow, deliberate, as if he wanted to exude authority. Malcolm rolled down his window as the officer approached, resting his hands visibly on the steering wheel. "License and registration," the officer said without a greeting, his tone cold and clipped. "Of course, officer," Malcolm replied evenly, reaching slowly for his wallet in the inner pocket of his blazer. The officer eyed him suspiciously. "Where you headed in such a hurry?" "I wasn't speeding, officer. I'm on my way to work," Malcolm said calmly. He handed over his license and registration, watching as the officer scrutinized the documents. "You driving this car?" the officer asked, glancing at the Tesla with a raised eyebrow. "Yes, sir. It's registered in my name, as you can see," Malcolm replied, a hint of steel creeping into his voice. The officer leaned in slightly, his gaze narrowing. "Nice ride. Expensive. What do you do for work?" Malcolm hesitated, sensing the underlying assumption in the question. He chose his words carefully. "I'm an executive at a tech firm downtown." The officer let out a low whistle, as though the notion of Malcolm owning a Tesla and being an executive was hard to swallow. "Must be nice," he muttered. Then, louder, "Sit tight." As the officer walked back to his car, Malcolm's stomach tightened. He knew where this could lead. He'd seen it before, on the news, in the stories shared by friends and family. But he also knew that losing his composure wouldn't help. Instead, he began to strategize, his mind racing to find a way to flip this script. Malcolm adjusted his rearview mirror, watching as the officer lingered in his patrol car. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. The discomfort of the moment began to seep in, but Malcolm reminded himself to remain calm. This wasn't his first encounter with prejudice, and sadly, it likely wouldn't be his last. Finally, the officer emerged, this time holding what looked like a citation pad. His sunglasses glinted in the sunlight as he sauntered back to Malcolm's car. Malcolm's jaw tightened as he prepared for the next exchange. "I ran your plates and license," the officer began, his voice dripping with condescension. "No warrants, no violations. But I'm still going to need to ask you a few more questions." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Officer, may I ask what I'm being detained for?" His voice was steady, professional, but there was an undertone of resolve that didn't go unnoticed. The officer smirked. "Routine stop. You looked out of place." He paused, scanning Malcolm's suit and the interior of the Tesla. "You sure this car isn't leased or borrowed?" Malcolm's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but he maintained his composure. "It's mine, officer. Bought it outright last year. If you'd like, I can provide you with proof of ownership." The officer ignored his offer and continued, "You know, we get a lot of stolen vehicles that look like this." "I'm just doing my job." "Stolen vehicles, you say?" Malcolm's tone remained calm, but his mind raced. He had a decision to make. Should he challenge the officer's motives now, or wait for an opportunity to expose the bias more effectively? The officer pressed on, ignoring the question. "What's in the trunk? Any contraband, weapons, or other items I should know about?" Malcolm exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath to steady himself. "Nothing illegal. Would you like to check?" "I'd be happy to cooperate." The officer hesitated, caught off guard by Malcolm's willingness. His hand hovered near the holster on his hip. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Malcolm complied without hesitation, stepping onto the gravel shoulder of the road. He stood tall, his calm demeanor and immaculate appearance in stark contrast to the officer's agitated energy. The officer motioned toward the trunk. "Open it." Malcolm nodded, using the key fob to pop the trunk remotely. The officer peered inside, finding nothing but a neatly packed gym bag and a stack of documents in a leather briefcase. "What's this?" the officer asked, pointing at the briefcase. "Work materials. Would you like to see?" The officer nodded, clearly searching for something, anything, to justify his stop. Malcolm opened the briefcase and handed over a folder. Inside were printed slides of his presentation on diversity and inclusion in tech, complete with graphs and bold headlines. The officer stared at the papers, his expression unreadable. "What's this supposed to be?" Malcolm crossed his arms, a faint smile playing on his lips. "It's the future, officer. But I'd be happy to explain it in detail if you have a moment." The officer squinted at him, unsure whether he was being mocked. "Just stand there while I finish up," he snapped, turning back to his patrol car with the folder in hand. As Malcolm watched him retreat, an idea began to form. A clever, unexpected way to confront the bias while staying true to his character. Malcolm leaned against his Tesla, watching as the officer returned to his patrol car with the folder in hand. He could see the officer flipping through the pages, his head tilting as he skimmed the graphs and bullet points. It was almost comical. Malcolm doubted the officer truly understood what he was looking at: market analyses, research on workplace diversity, and a detailed roadmap for fostering inclusivity in the tech industry. It was far removed from whatever narrative the officer had initially formed about him. After a few minutes, the officer stepped out again, holding the folder awkwardly. He approached Malcolm, his face betraying a mix of annoyance and confusion. "So, the officer cleared his throat, clearly fishing for a way to regain control of the interaction. "You're some kind of consultant or something?" Malcolm smiled faintly. "Not exactly. I'm the Chief Operations Officer for Centellus Tech. We're a leading firm in tech innovation. This," he gestured to the folder, "is part of a presentation I'll be giving today to a room full of CEOs. The officer's expression shifted, but his tone remained defensive. "All right, but that doesn't explain why you were acting suspicious." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? Officer, I was driving below the speed limit on autopilot. My license and registration are clean, and my car is registered in my name. If there's something specific you're concerned about, I'd be happy to clarify." The officer hesitated, clearly realizing how weak his justification sounded when laid bare. He shifted uncomfortably. "Just doing my job," he muttered, his voice lacking the confidence it held earlier. Malcolm glanced at the patrol car's dashboard cam, its blinking light signaling that the interaction was being recorded. A part of him wanted to let the officer dig himself deeper, but he decided to shift the dynamic in a more strategic way. "Officer, may I ask you a question?" Malcolm's tone was polite but firm, the kind of tone that demanded attention. The officer blinked. "What? If you're truly concerned about stolen cars or illegal activity, shouldn't your focus be on behavior rather than assumptions about how someone looks?" The officer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Malcolm took a step closer, his presence commanding but non-threatening. "Because if the goal is public safety, then stopping someone like me, a professional on his way to work, based on stereotypes isn't just inefficient. It's harmful. It undermines trust and wastes time. Yours and mine." The officer's face darkened, his defensive posture returning. "I'm not saying you did anything wrong. I just needed to be sure." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But now that we've established there's nothing amiss, I'd like to get to my meeting. Unless, of course, you need help with the data in that folder. It could offer some insights into why interactions like this one are a recurring issue." The officer stiffened, clearly caught off guard by Malcolm's calm but incisive response. For a moment, the air between them was heavy with unspoken tension. And then, as the officer glanced back at the folder in his hand, something shifted. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, as if Malcolm's words were beginning to sink in. "Hold tight," the officer said brusquely, retreating to his patrol car once more. Malcolm watched him go, the seeds of his plan firmly planted. The wheels were in motion now, and the resolution, unexpected yet inevitable, was drawing closer. Malcolm stood beside his Tesla, the autumn breeze tugging at his blazer as he watched the officer settle into his patrol car. From this vantage point, Malcolm could see the officer tapping at his onboard computer, occasionally glancing at the folder he had taken. Malcolm's mind raced as he anticipated the next move. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It had evolved into a power struggle, a microcosm of the biases Malcolm had encountered throughout his life. He thought of his grandfather, a civil rights activist who had marched in Selma, and his mother, a trailblazing attorney who had taught him the importance of grace under pressure. The officer finally stepped out of the patrol car again, this time holding a ticket in his hand. As he approached, Malcolm noted a slight hesitation in his stride, as if he wasn't entirely confident about what he was about to say. "Here's the deal," the officer began, his tone less abrasive but still firm. "I'm writing you a citation for failing to signal a lane change back there." Malcolm's brow furrowed. Lane change? He thought back to his drive. The Tesla, in autopilot mode, had flawlessly followed every traffic rule. "Officer, with all due respect, I'm certain I didn't fail to signal." The officer shrugged, his aviators masking his eyes. "That's my call to make. You can contest it in court if you want." Malcolm took the ticket, glancing over the details. His name and vehicle information were correct, but the infraction was clearly fabricated. A subtle tactic, meant to justify the stop without admitting fault. He looked back at the officer, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I see," he said quietly, folding the ticket and slipping it into his pocket. The officer smirked slightly, mistaking Malcolm's acceptance for defeat. "Drive safely," he said, turning to leave. "Officer," Malcolm called, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. The officer stopped, turning back. "What?" Malcolm stepped closer, his expression neutral but his tone laced with authority. "May I take your name and badge number for my records? It's standard protocol for me to document interactions like these." The officer stiffened. "It's on the ticket," he said, gesturing vaguely. "Of course," Malcolm replied. "But I'd like to confirm it directly, just to avoid any potential clerical errors." The officer hesitated before reluctantly muttering his name and badge number. Malcolm repeated it back, ensuring he had it correct, before pulling out his phone. Without breaking eye contact, he snapped a picture of the patrol car, its license plate and dash cam clearly visible. Then he unlocked his phone and began typing notes. "What are you doing?" the officer asked sharply, his composure starting to crack. "Following protocol," Malcolm said smoothly. "Documenting this interaction for internal purposes. You see, officer, my company has a partnership with the local government to analyze policing patterns. It's part of an initiative to improve public trust and reduce bias in law enforcement." The officer blinked, clearly taken aback. What are you talking about? Malcolm tucked his phone away, the faintest smile on his lips. I'll let the data speak for itself. Have a good day, officer. He walked back to his Tesla, leaving the officer standing there, stunned. Malcolm could feel the weight of the moment, the shift in power as the officer began to realize that this wasn't a routine stop for someone without resources or recourse. Sliding into the driver's seat, Malcolm started the car, the soft hum of the engine breaking the silence. As he pulled back onto the road, his mind was already working on the next step. This wasn't over, not yet. Malcolm drove in silence, the morning sunlight glinting off the Tesla's sleek exterior. The ticket sat on the passenger seat, a tangible reminder of the interaction he had just endured. His mind replayed the exchange, not with anger, but with a sense of purpose. This is the moment, he thought, gripping the wheel. He reached for his phone and activated the voice assistant. Call Tasha, he said, his voice steady. Tasha Pearson, his firm's in-house legal counsel, picked up on the second ring. Morning, Malcolm. What's up? Aren't you supposed to be heading to your big meeting? Good morning, Tasha, Malcolm replied. I'll still make it, but I need a favor. I just had a run-in with an officer on the way. He fabricated a citation, and the situation felt off. I'm going to send you some details, including his name and badge number. Can you look into his record for any patterns of similar behavior? Tasha's voice sharpened. Are you okay? Did anything escalate? I'm fine, Malcolm assured her. It didn't escalate because I didn't let it. But something tells me this isn't the first time he's acted this way. You know I'll handle it, Tasha said. Send me everything you've got, and I'll start digging. Thanks, Malcolm said, ending the call. As the car's autopilot handled the last stretch to his office, Malcolm composed an email to the city's community policing liaison. He included the officer's details, the ticket information, and a brief summary of the encounter. He CC'd Tasha and his firm's PR team, knowing they'd amplify the issue if necessary. By the time he arrived at the office, Malcolm was greeted by his assistant, Jordan, who handed him a cup of coffee. You're cutting it close today, boss. Everything okay? Malcolm smiled, taking the coffee. Let's just say I had an unexpected detour. Is the conference room ready? Set and waiting, Jordan confirmed. Malcolm walked through the bustling office, his stride confident, his focus unwavering. The room full of executives greeted him with polite nods and murmurs of admiration as he entered. His reputation as a visionary leader preceded him. The presentation began smoothly. Malcolm spoke with passion about the importance of diversity, illustrating how companies that embraced it saw exponential growth in creativity and productivity. The slides from his folder, now back in his possession, drew murmurs of agreement as he laid out his strategy. Midway through, Malcolm paused. Before we move to the next section, I'd like to share something that happened to me this morning, he said, his voice calm but firm. The room fell silent. I was pulled over on my way here, he continued. Stopped, questioned, and cited for a fabricated infraction. Why? Because the officer believed I didn't fit the image of someone who should be driving my car or wearing this suit. The tension in the room was palpable. Malcolm scanned the faces of the executives, many of whom were clearly uncomfortable. I share this not for sympathy, he said, but to highlight why our work matters. Bias isn't just an abstract concept. It's a daily reality for millions of people, and it hinders progress, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. The room erupted into applause, the executives visibly moved by Malcolm's words. He continued the presentation with renewed vigor, the morning's events fueling his resolve. When the meeting concluded, Malcolm checked his phone. A text from Tasha awaited him. You were right. Found a pattern. Let's talk. Malcolm's eyes narrowed as he read the message. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about ensuring no one else faced the same unjust treatment. After the meeting, Malcolm retreated to his corner office, the city skyline stretching out behind him. The text from Tasha weighed on his mind. He dialed her number, leaning back in his chair as the call connected. Malcolm, Tasha greeted, her tone urgent. I've been digging into the officer's record, and you were right to suspect something. His name is Officer Darren Cole. He's been with the force for 7 years and has a troubling history of complaints. Malcolm straightened. What kind of complaints? Racial profiling, excessive stops without cause, and even a couple of misconduct allegations. Most of these cases were quietly settled or dismissed due to lack of evidence, probably because many of the individuals he targeted didn't have the means to fight back. Malcolm felt a familiar frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. And no one's held him accountable? Not yet, Tasha said. But this time might be different. You've got the resources, and with your standing in the community, this could shine a light on his behavior in a way that's hard to ignore. Malcolm nodded, his mind already forming a plan. Let's escalate this. Reach out to the local media contacts we've worked with before. This isn't just about me, it's about a systemic issue that needs addressing. You're sure about this? Tasha asked. Going public means opening yourself up to scrutiny too. I'm sure, Malcolm replied. This is bigger than me. As he ended the call, Malcolm's assistant, Jordan, poked his head into the office. Hey, Malcolm, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. Malcolm frowned. Who is it? Jordan hesitated. It's a police officer. The words hung in the air. Malcolm's pulse quickened, but he kept his face neutral. Send him in. Moments later, Officer Cole stepped into the office, his posture rigid, his aviators tucked into his chest pocket. Out of uniform and in plainclothes, he seemed less imposing, though the tension between them was palpable. Mr. Green, Cole began, his tone clipped. I hope I'm not interrupting. You are, Malcolm said evenly, gesturing to a chair. But I'm curious as to why you're here. Cole hesitated before sitting. Look, I'll cut to the chase. I heard from a colleague that you're digging into my record. I figured I'd come here and clear the air before this gets blown out of proportion. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Clear the air? That's an interesting choice of words, Officer Cole. Cole's jaw tightened. I was doing my job this morning. Maybe I misjudged the situation, but that doesn't mean I'm some kind of racist. Malcolm leaned forward, his gaze steady. You didn't misjudge. You acted on bias, whether conscious or not. And let me be clear, this isn't about labeling you as anything. It's about accountability. Cole bristled. So, what? You're going to ruin my career over a traffic stop? Malcolm tilted his head, considering the man in front of him. That depends. What do you think your career is worth? Cole blinked, caught off guard by the question. Malcolm continued, his voice calm but firm. You have an opportunity here, officer. Not just to protect your career, but to make amends for the harm you've caused, not just to me, but to others who didn't have the platform to push back. What you choose to do next will determine the outcome. Cole stared at him, the weight of Malcolm's words sinking in. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. I'll think about it, Cole muttered, standing abruptly. Do that, Malcolm said, his tone sharp. But don't take too long. The wheels are already in motion. As Cole left the office, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about challenging one officer. It was about confronting a system that allowed these patterns to persist. And Malcolm wasn't backing down. Malcolm's office hummed with activity as his team rallied around the situation. The legal department, led by Tasha, was meticulously combing through Officer Cole's history. Meanwhile, the PR team crafted a narrative that highlighted the broader issues of systemic bias while keeping the focus on solutions rather than personal vendettas. By mid-afternoon, Malcolm was on a Zoom call with Marla Jensen, the city's community policing liaison. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had earned her reputation for bridging the gap between citizens and law enforcement. Malcolm, Marla said, her voice steady. I've read your email and seen the documentation. I also had a look at Officer Cole's record after you brought it to my attention. There's enough here to warrant a review, but going public might complicate things. Complicate for whom? Malcolm asked, his tone calm, but pointed. Marla sighed. The department, for starters. But also for you. I've seen these situations spiral out of control. The media attention can get messy, and the message you're trying to send can get lost in the noise. I understand your concern, Malcolm replied, but staying silent guarantees nothing changes. This isn't just about me. It's about a pattern of behavior that erodes trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Marla nodded slowly. I get it, and I respect what you're trying to do. Let me talk to the department's leadership. Maybe there's a way to address this internally without escalating it into a public spectacle. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He appreciated Marla's pragmatism, but he knew the risk of letting the system police itself. I'll give you 48 hours, he said finally. But if there's no meaningful action by then, I'll take it public. Marla frowned but nodded. Fair enough. I'll be in touch. After the call, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city skyline. His mind wandered to the officer's unexpected visit earlier. There had been something in Cole's demeanor, a crack in his bravado. "Jordan," Malcolm called, his assistant quickly appearing in the doorway. "Yeah, boss? Can you get me the contact information for the officer who stopped me this morning?" "The one who visited earlier, Cole." Jordan hesitated. "Are you sure? He didn't exactly leave on the best terms." "I'm sure," Malcolm said firmly. A short while later, Malcolm dialed the number Jordan provided. Cole answered after the second ring, his voice guarded. "Hello? Officer Cole," Malcolm began. "It's Malcolm Green. I wanted to follow up on our conversation earlier." Cole was silent for a moment. "What do you want?" "I want to offer you an opportunity," Malcolm said. "Not a threat, not a demand. An opportunity to be part of the solution instead of the problem." Cole scoffed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm willing to work with you," Malcolm said. "This doesn't have to end with a ruined career or a lawsuit. But it does have to end with accountability and change. You know your actions this morning were wrong. The question is, what are you willing to do about it?" Cole's breathing was audible over the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we meet," Malcolm said. "Off the record. No cameras, no lawyers. Just a conversation about what happened, and what can happen next." The line went silent again. "Fine," Cole said finally. "When and where?" Malcolm smiled faintly. "Tomorrow. I'll send you the details." As the call ended, Malcolm felt the weight of the day's events begin to shift. He didn't know if Cole would follow through or if the conversation would lead anywhere meaningful. But he was willing to try. Because change, Malcolm knew, often started with a single step, even from the most unexpected places. The next day, Malcolm chose a quiet coffee shop on the edge of downtown for the meeting. It was a neutral, public space where the conversation could unfold without unnecessary tension. He arrived early, settling at a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of conversation around him. He didn't have to wait long. Officer Darren Cole walked in, looking out of place in jeans and a plain gray jacket. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Malcolm. Their gazes locked for a brief moment before Cole approached the table. "Mr. Green," Cole said, his tone cautious as he sat across from him. "Officer Cole," Malcolm replied evenly. "Thank you for coming." Cole shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Let's get something straight. I'm here to listen, not to admit to anything." Malcolm nodded, unbothered. "Fair enough. But let's also be clear, I'm not here to attack you. I'm here because I believe conversations like this are the only way to bridge the gap between people like us." Cole frowned, leaning back slightly. "People like us? You and me," Malcolm clarified. "Two people on opposite sides of a problem that's bigger than both of us. You see a black man in a Tesla, and your first instinct is suspicion. I see a cop pulling me over, and my first instinct is preparation for the worst. That's not personal, that's systemic. And we both know it." Cole's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "You probably thought you were doing your job," Malcolm continued. "But what you may not realize is how that kind of profiling undermines trust in law enforcement, not just from people like me, but from the entire community." Cole looked down at the table, his fingers tapping lightly against his coffee cup. "You think I don't know that? I've been doing this job long enough to see how things spiral. But you don't understand what it's like on my end either. Every car, every stop, it's all a risk. And sometimes, you make a call based on instinct." Malcolm leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Instinct isn't the problem. Bias is. And when your instincts are shaped by bias, they lead to stops like the one I experienced. Do you see the difference?" Cole didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "So, what do you want from me? An apology? A confession?" "I want change," Malcolm said simply. "Not just from you, but from the system you represent. And I believe you have a role to play in making that happen." Cole frowned. "How?" "Start by owning your actions," Malcolm said. "Acknowledge the harm caused, not just to me, but to others you've stopped unfairly. And then, use your position to advocate for better training, for accountability, and for policies that reduce bias." Cole let out a short laugh, shaking his head. You make it sound so easy. It's not, Malcolm admitted. But nothing worth doing ever is. You've been in this system long enough to know its flaws. The question is, are you willing to help fix them? The weight of Malcolm's words hung in the air. Cole looked away, his expression conflicted. I don't know if I can do that, Cole admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. You can, Malcolm said firmly. But only if you choose to. The alternative is letting this pattern continue, unchecked, until it destroys trust completely. Is that the legacy you want to leave behind? Cole didn't answer. Instead, he stared into his coffee, as though searching for something he couldn't quite find. Malcolm let the silence linger, knowing that real change often required time, and that the seeds he was planting today might not bear fruit until much later. Cole remained silent for several minutes, his gaze fixed on the coffee cup in his hands. The quiet in the cafe seemed to wrap around them, broken only by the occasional clink of plates or murmurs from other patrons. Malcolm waited, giving the officer space to process. Finally, Cole looked up, his face a mixture of frustration and weariness. You know, people like to paint cops as villains these days, he said, his voice low. It's easy to point fingers when you don't see what we deal with every day. You're right. I've let bias influence my actions. But I'm not the only one. The whole system's broken. Malcolm nodded, his expression empathetic but firm. I don't doubt that, but acknowledging the system is broken doesn't absolve individuals of their responsibility. It starts with you, Darren. One person stepping up to say, this isn't right, can inspire others to do the same. Cole leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. And what happens if I do that? I'll be ostracized by my colleagues, seen as a traitor in my own department. Or, Malcolm countered, you'll be seen as a leader, someone who had the courage to speak up when it mattered. Change always comes with resistance, but progress never happens without sacrifice. Cole rubbed his temples, clearly grappling with the weight of Malcolm's words. You really believe all that? That one person can make a difference? Malcolm smiled faintly. I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't. My grandfather marched in Selma when the odds were stacked against him. My mother fought her way through law school when women, let alone black women, weren't welcome in those spaces. Change doesn't come easy, but it always starts with someone who's willing to try. Cole sighed, the resistance in his demeanor softening. So, what exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that we work together, Malcolm said. You help me push for reforms from the inside, and I'll amplify your voice on the outside. Together, we can show that accountability isn't about punishment, it's about growth. Cole hesitated, his skepticism evident. And you think the department's just going to roll over and listen to me? No, Malcolm admitted. But they'll listen when the community demands it. And if you stand with the community, you won't be alone. Cole tapped his fingers against the table, his internal struggle evident. This is a lot to take in, he said finally. I don't expect you to decide right now, Malcolm said. But I do expect you to think about what kind of impact you want to leave behind. This morning could be just another bad encounter, or it could be the turning point for something bigger. The words hung in the air, a challenge that Cole couldn't ignore. He stood, pushing his chair back. I'll think about it, he said, his tone cautious but sincere. Malcolm extended his hand. That's all I ask. After a brief hesitation, Cole shook it, his grip firm but unsure. He walked out of the cafe without another word, leaving Malcolm alone at the table. As Malcolm watched him go, he felt a glimmer of hope. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, and there was no guarantee that Cole would follow through. But for the first time, there was a chance, a small but significant crack in the wall of resistance. Malcolm reached for his phone, texting Tasha a simple update, meeting done. He's thinking about it, let's stay ready. The next steps were unclear, but Malcolm was resolute. Change wasn't just a possibility, it was a necessity. And he would see it through, no matter how long it took. The following weeks were a whirlwind for Malcolm. The conversation with Officer Cole, though brief, had ignited something. Cole had reached out to him a few days after their meeting, asking to meet again. This time, it was clear. Cole was willing to take a step toward accountability. The process wasn't instantaneous, nor was it without hurdles. But Malcolm and Cole began working together behind the scenes, speaking with community leaders, activists, and members of the police department who were genuinely committed to reform. They organized confidential discussions, slowly building a coalition of officers willing to look at their own biases and contribute to a new initiative for anti-bias training and systemic reform within the department. Cole became an unlikely ally, using his position to advocate for these changes from within. He attended town halls with Malcolm, where they spoke openly about the importance of reform and accountability. Malcolm's presence as a prominent public figure added legitimacy to the cause, and Cole's participation, as an officer, gave the initiative a unique level of authenticity. In the media, the story of Cole's shift, his willingness to acknowledge his own mistakes and work toward change, spread quickly. The coverage was mixed at first, with many questioning whether the change would be real or just another empty gesture. But as Cole continued to push for reform and spoke openly about his journey, people began to listen. And then, just when it seemed like the initiative might hit another roadblock, something unexpected happened. Malcolm's team received an anonymous letter, handwritten and carefully worded, that laid out a detailed account of the many cases of misconduct that Officer Cole had been involved in over the years, many of which had been quietly dismissed by the department. But unlike the past, this time the letter didn't just point fingers, it offered solutions. It suggested independent oversight, enhanced training for officers in high-stress situations, and an internal review of policies that allowed such misconduct to go unchecked. At first, Malcolm was wary of the letter's true origins, but the details matched up. It wasn't from an outside source. It was clear that someone within the department, someone who had seen firsthand the damage caused by unaddressed bias, was taking a risk to finally confront the issue. This letter sparked a much-needed investigation into Officer Cole's past actions, and soon, the police department was forced to take a closer look at its internal processes. The investigations into the allegations were swift, thorough, and for the first time, transparent. Cole himself cooperated, acknowledging his past mistakes and offering to participate in any corrective actions necessary. Though the road wasn't without its obstacles, the department began to slowly transform. Policy changes were enacted, mandatory bias and de-escalation training were introduced to all officers. New protocols for handling misconduct were established, ensuring accountability. Malcolm was invited to speak at the department's annual conference, where he shared his experience and his vision for a more equitable system. The real turning point came when Officer Cole stood alongside Malcolm at a press conference. In front of the city's media, Cole spoke publicly about his role in the reforms and his own journey toward understanding the deep-rooted biases that had affected his work. His words were candid, honest, and, above all, sincere. Reform isn't easy, Cole said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. And it doesn't happen overnight. But it starts with accountability. It starts with facing your mistakes and doing the hard work to make things right. Malcolm watched from the sidelines, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. This wasn't the victory he had imagined when he'd first been pulled over by Officer Cole. But in many ways, it was more profound. It wasn't about getting even, it was about creating a lasting change that would affect not just Cole, but future officers and ultimately, the community as a whole. As the press conference concluded, the sound of applause echoed in the room. Malcolm turned to Cole, giving him a brief nod of acknowledgement. Cole smiled, a hint of relief in his eyes. "I didn't think this was where we'd end up when we first met," Cole said quietly. "Neither did I," Malcolm replied, his tone filled with quiet pride. But sometimes, the best things come from unexpected places. The journey wasn't over. The work was ongoing, and there would always be more to do. But for the first time, Malcolm felt hopeful that true change, real, systemic change, was not only possible but happening. And that, he realized, was enough for now. The end.